Hello everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all for taking the time to come out tonight to hear an update on the Nyanza Chemical Waste Dump Superfund site. I am Zanetta Purnell. I am the Community Involvement Coordinator with EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And to start off, we are going to start with introductions in regards to the site team. So we'll start with EPA and then we'll go to Mass DEP, which is the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and they will give introductions as well.
Hi everyone, I am Lisa Thuet and I am the remedial project manager that's currently assigned to the Nyanza Superfund site. I've been working on this site for about 2 years. I took it over from Dan Keefe, who was the last RPM, and I've been working with the town and Mass DEP, and we've had a really good working relationship, and we're interested in telling you a little bit more about some potential next steps we have for this site. And I guess maybe just want to mention that we're not here because anything has particularly changed, but it's more we're here to talk about what more we could possibly do for the groundwater at this site.
Good evening. My name is Lynn Jennings. I'm the section chief of the Massachusetts Superfund section with EPA. You guys want to come up, or do you want me to introduce you?
I'm Jennifer McQueenie. I'm with Mass DEP Nyanza site.
I'm Dave Buckley, also with Mass DEP. I used to be the project manager for the site. I'm still kind of involved indirectly.
Hi, and I'm Diane Baxter, also with Mass DEP. I'm the director of the Federal Sites Group at Mass DEP.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Just one last note before I pass it over. There are sign-in sheets outside, so if you haven't had a chance to sign in, please do so. It's just for purposes of future communication in regards to the Nyanza site. In addition, we did run out of handouts. I should have came a little bit more handy, but the proposed plan is available on the EPA website, and the town has also posted it on their website as well. And if you want me to email you a copy directly, you can feel free to touch base with me following this meeting.
Again, thank you for coming tonight. I'd also like to thank Mark Oram, the health agent, for continuously working with us and also for helping us plan this meeting. And I'd also like to thank Mike Herbert, the town manager, the school, and all the people here that were here earlier helping us set up, the cable crew, Jeff, giving us the mic check. Appreciate all the help everybody gave us. So on January 14th, EPA issued its proposed plan for the next phase of cleanup at the site. We are currently conducting a 30-day public comment period on this proposed plan. Zanetta noted that we did have copies, and I'm sorry that you guys didn't all get a copy, but it's on our website, and we can certainly provide more copies to anybody that would like a hard copy. There are 2 objectives for tonight's meeting. First of all, we'd like to conduct an information session to present our proposed plan for the remaining contamination at the site and to answer any questions you may have about our plan. Second, we'd like to conduct a formal public hearing for those of you wishing to offer oral comments tonight. I'd like to just give a little bit more background for the format for tonight's meeting. So the first objective is to provide the information on our proposed plan. So following my remarks, Lisa Thuart, the project manager for EPA, is going to provide about a 20-minute presentation, including some site history, some background on the alternatives that we considered, and what our actual proposed plan is. Following Lisa's presentation, we'll just open up the meeting for a very informal question and answer session. I see that there's a lot of you. We're going to do our best to try to get through as many questions as we can, but we will probably have to put a time limit on the informal part of this to allow time for the formal part of it. So after the informal question and answer, we'll do a formal public hearing, and I will be the hearing officer for that. I'm going to try to see about starting that around 7:30. So during this time, we'll accept oral comments on the proposed plan. Those of you wishing to comment, you should have indicated so on the sign-in sheet, because we're basically going to be calling you up one by one to issue your oral comment at the microphone. Any comments raised during this second session will receive a written response from EPA when we issue our final decision document. If you asked a question or made a comment in the informal part and you'd like it to be part of our official record, you should repeat that comment as part of the oral hearing. If you choose not to comment tonight, you may still submit written comments to us either through email or through parcel post and snail mail. The address you should send that to is actually on the proposed plan. Our comment period ends on February 14th, and comments postmarked by this date will be included in the record and will receive a written response from EPA when we issue our final decision. Does anybody have any questions on the format for the meeting? Great. Hearing none, I'd like to introduce Lisa again to give a presentation. Thank you.
Welcome again, everyone. I'm Lisa Thewitt, and we just have a quick agenda just to talk about what we're going to discuss tonight. Some people may or may not be aware of all the site history, so we're just going to quickly go over that. We're going to go over some of the operable units that we have set up for Nyanza. We're going to go over some of our remedies that we have considered and proposed for the remaining groundwater cleanup at the site. We also will discuss our preferred remedy that we think could potentially be done for this remaining contamination at the site. And then we'll go over some site challenges that we would potentially be facing. And again, I just wanted to kind of reiterate that we're kind of here tonight because nothing has particularly changed, but what we're here to kind of talk about what more we could possibly do for this operable Unit 2, which is the last piece of Nyanza. It's the groundwater that's flowing, from the site toward the Sudbury River. And at this time, it's not being used for drinking water, but it still does present a risk at the site. So just to talk a little bit about the site history, people may or may not be aware that this site was basically manufacturing various types of textile dyes and dye intermediates. And over a 60-year period, there were several companies that were operating on the property. The most recent one was called Nyanza Incorporated, hence that's the name of the site. Quite a bit of chemical waste was dumped on the property in various means. There was an underground vault, there were lagoons, there were drums dumped on this what's called Magungo Hill, which is now the Cap landfill. There were wastewater discharges from the dye manufacturing operation that went into what's called Chemical Brook, appropriately, which runs along the railroad tracks and eventually goes into the Sudbury River. Based on the contamination that was found at the site back in the 80s, the site was added to the EPA National Priorities List for Superfund back in 1982 because it did require, remedial attention by EPA. From the time frame of the late 80s through 2016, there have been various, removal actions and different remedial steps that have been done. Okay, next slide. So for purposes of site cleanup or site remediation, the Superfund site was divided into 4 operable units. Operable Unit 1 had posed what was considered at the time the biggest risk. So it was all of the sludges and the contaminated soils that were on the property itself. So that all that work basically took place in the late 1980s and the early 1990s when the landfill was capped and the site proper itself was excavated. Operable Unit 2 is what we're talking about as proposed plan. And again, that's the groundwater that's emanating from the site, flowing, through the former manufacturing area, through downtown Ashland and toward the Sudbury River. We have had a series of interim remedial actions for operable Unit 2. Over the years, they were originally going to put in a groundwater treatment plant, and then they ended up discovering pools of what's called dense non-aqueous phase liquid, DNAPL. So two extraction systems were put in place to extract DNAPL from the site. Back in the early 90s, we recognized that there could have been a potential vapor intrusion risk at operable Unit 2. So vapor mitigation systems were put in place in properties where indoor air testing was done. While we have done some work on operable Unit 2, we don't have a final decision document just yet for this particular piece. And that's what this proposed plan and proposed cleanup plan is looking to do. Operable Unit 3 was a lot of the wetlands work that was done because there was a tremendous amount of mercury contamination in the sediments of like the eastern wetlands and Trolley Brook, and all of that was feeding the Sudbury River, and it was feeding the mercury contamination in the Sudbury River. And the river itself became its own operable unit, and that was kind of focused on looking at sediment levels of mercury, fish tissue accumulations in the mercury fish in fish tissue, and whether or not there were sections of the river that needed to be capped. In the end, they decided not to do the sand capping, but they did post, advisory signs. We have the state, Mass DEP, actually performs quite a few operations and maintenance activities for all of the remedial actions that have been completed, including the river, including the landfill. We have inspections, monitoring, and maintenance, so we're very appreciative of the work that they do to support what we've done so far at Nyanza. Okay. This is kind of a bit of a site overview. Microphone out here. Okay, I'm just going to point with the laser. So right here is basically the property known as Worcester Air Conditioning, and this spot right here is where we currently are have a system to extract this dense non-aqueous phase liquid that I had been discussing. And this is what's called the Nyanza property, and this is where we also have another extraction system in place. And these were two test systems that were put in 2013. To see what kind of residual contamination we could pull up on these properties. And this particular one is right next to this vault, which was a source of a lot of the contamination into Chemical Brook that runs along the railroad tracks. This is the capped landfill, where we currently actually just had a solar array was recently installed on this capped landfill, which we think is a good reuse. Then we just had some other areas that were contaminant sources on the manufacturing property. There were lagoons, there were some settling ponds. This is the wetland that unfortunately received a lot of the discharge from the mercury contamination. And again, all of this kind of feeds and makes its way up to the Sudbury River here. This particular area that we have shaded, this is what we're calling our vapor mitigation system area. And this is where back in 2007, EPA had installed on a voluntary basis vapor mitigation systems, which are similar to radon systems. And that was designed to prevent any vapors that might be coming out of the groundwater and migrating through unsaturated soils. We did not want any volatile organic compound vapors going into people's first floors or basements of their homes. So we did that as a temporary interim measure to mitigate this vapor intrusion risk that originally was not known about back in the 1990s. Okay, next slide. So this is just a bit of an overview of the site contaminants of concern, and basically our proposed plan focuses on these volatile organic compounds, in particular the trichloroethene, which is present in this DNAPL, this pool of residual chemicals that is still scattered in parts of the property, and this is what contributes to the vapor intrusion risk and some of the risk if people are exposed to the groundwater. And again, as I had mentioned, like nobody is drinking the groundwater, and currently to our knowledge, nobody has any private wells within the area where people are not extracting the groundwater. within the former site property, we also have, restrictions so that people can't extract groundwater in some of the former industrial areas to prevent exposure there. We have some what's called semi-volatile organic compounds. Those have also been identified at the site. And not so much in the groundwater, but mercury was a big concern in, again, the soils, the sediments, in the wetlands in the Sudbury River. Okay. So this is just a bit of a history on this operable Unit 2. Back in 1994, when they were originally thinking about putting in a groundwater treatment plant, this DNAPL, dense non-aqueous phase liquid, was discovered. It's a mix of chemicals, including the TCE and various chlorobenzenes. And they're called dense because they are not something that's going to float on water. They sink down to the bottom of the aquifer. So unfortunately, they get into the bedrock, fractures, and they can pool in different places because they're a heavier contaminant. These pools of DNAPL are what we think are, sourcing the dissolved contamination in the groundwater that's flowing through town. So we are looking to target that. And again, the groundwater kind of flows from the site in the north-northeast direction toward the river. And again, we talked a little bit about the vapor intrusion risk and how we, as a short-term measure, we put in these vapor mitigation systems in various homes and businesses within that shaded vapor mitigation area to try to, reduce and mitigate some of this vapor intrusion risk. Okay, next slide. So this is called the overburden aquifer TCE. So TCE, again, is our biggest contaminant of concern. So the overburden is basically kind of looking at shallower depths up to about 35 feet. And this is where we have the most concern with the groundwater because it's closer to the surface and therefore can pose more of a vapor intrusion risk. Or, if people are doing excavating activities, this is where people can come into contact with the groundwater. So although, since the early 2000s or even the 1990s, although the concentration of some of these contaminants has gone down over time, in the last several years, these concentrations have stabilized, and they really aren't showing us any signs that further contaminant degradation is going to occur. So it's almost like we're in a steady state situation where it's not getting any worse, but it's not getting any better. And this is kind of just an array of, because the bedrock is kind of complex. The site has a very highly fractured network geology. So unfortunately, we can get these bedrock hotspots that will show up at different portions throughout the site. As you can see, as far as the bedrock goes, because this is where we feel there's still potentially a lot of DNAPL, we do see quite a bit of TCE, some higher levels of TCE in the areas where you had the former manufacturing occurring. And this is just, again, kind of a summary of some of the interim operable Unit 2 remedial actions that have been done. We had an interim record of decision. We've done quite a bit of groundwater monitoring over the years. We had these indoor air monitoring events where we could get access to people's property. There were some ecological risks are done to determine whether or not this volatile organic compound plume was impacting the Sudbury River. There was a human health risk assessment done based on the indoor air data. And this explanation of significant differences is another interim decision document that allowed us to put in those DNAPL extraction wells that I had discussed, as well as the vapor mitigation systems. And again, those were installed in 2013. And then we decided we were going to do some additional air monitoring in people's basements and homes that were sort of outside of the existing vapor mitigation area to see if we needed to install any additional systems. But thankfully, we did not, outside that zone, we did not come across any properties in the samples that we tested that required an additional system in place. So that was actually positive. And again, based on the fact that the plume isn't really changing much, we initiated this feasibility study to evaluate potential remedial alternatives that we could potentially implement for operable Unit 2, and that started in about like late 2018 and ran through all of last year. And that allowed us to look at these alternatives and prepare a proposed plan, which is what we're seeking the public comments on. And some of the factors why we feel we can move forward with a proposed plan and a final remedy, we've had some successful results with these two pilot extraction systems, so we're hoping that we can expand on that and look for and find some additional like contaminant sources. In the last 20 years, technologies have significantly improved. Drilling techniques have improved, so we're really hoping we can capitalize on that. Again, we still have some elevated compounds in the groundwater. We still have a vapor intrusion risk, and we do have a risk of people coming into contact with shallow groundwater, especially in downtown Ashland. If there are cases where we've got like construction activities, people are doing utility work, so those are still some factors which are kind of driving forward our decision to come up with this proposed plan. And eventually, the existing vapor mitigation systems that we have, we would like to remove those so that if the groundwater levels get to a point where they're no longer causing an inhalation risk, that would also be our other goal. So we looked at 9 remedial alternatives, and based on some factors, we screened out a few, and we have 6 that we looked at in greater detail. So there's 2 sort of like areas of concern that we call, that we're sort of that are going to be mentioned in the proposed plan. And this NIACOL and WAC stands for Worcester Air Conditioning. They just happen to get they just happen to be the names of the 2 companies where where the former manufacturing areas of Nyanza existed. So these are sections of these 2 industrial properties where DNAPL had been discovered, where we have the highest levels in the bedrock, where we have these elevated concentrations, and where we have these test pilot extraction systems now. And then whatever is sort of down gradient of the former manufacturing areas, that's what we're calling our down gradient plume area of concern. And again, this is where we have higher concentrations, dissolved volatile organic compound concentrations in the groundwater. And it's also where we have identified a potential vapor intrusion risk, again, as this plume is flowing below ground toward the Sudbury River. And this is just a map of the areas of concern. So this is right here kind of focuses on the area where we had the former manufacturing. This yellow line kind of just represents when we were doing the feasibility study, the area that we were looking at, that we were focusing on. And this pink purpley color is what they're calling sort of the plume. And again, this is sort of the flow path toward the river. And just sort of spread out, we have just here and there, we've got in the bedrock away from the site, we do have some what they're considered like just a little bit higher hot spots that we don't necessarily have an answer to why that is, but again, it could very well be due to the complex geology. So this is a quick summary, and I'll try to get through these rather quickly so people can start asking some questions. But these are the 6 alternatives that we looked at in kind of closer detail, and one of them that we're required to look at is like no further action. What would it be if we just continue to do what we're doing now? We continue to operate the existing extraction systems. We would continue to maintain the vapor mitigation systems that we have in the buildings. And we would be doing 5-year reviews to assess the protectiveness of the remedies that we've put into place. So we kind of like attached a cost to each of these. And this would be like sort of an estimated cost of $108,000. The second remedy we looked at is called GW2, and again, these are just sort of like a numeric number assignment. And this is sort of continuing what we already started with the DNAPL extraction, but with also an enhancement and expanding. So again, we would do like a pre-design investigation to see, can we locate with these newer drilling technologies and more modern drilling, more modern investigatory technologies that we have, can we find additional pools of this DNAPL, of these residual compounds that are unfortunately like feeding the groundwater plume. So this would pretty much just be focusing on that former manufacturing area where the Nyanza and Worcester air conditioning properties are now. So this would be doing expanding the existing DNAPL extraction and then also potentially adding what's called some institutional controls, which are either legal and or administrative measures that can be put into place as an added measure so that people do not become exposed to the groundwater. And that might be a case of, we have an ordinance that says you can't have, if you are within a certain area, you can't have a private well, for example. But it would be additional measures above and beyond any engineered controls that we do. And this particular remedy has a cost of $5.9 million. Okay, next. So this GW4, this is what we're calling our preferred or our proposed remedy, because we feel that it focuses on what we really are looking to do. This would include the GW2 component, so it would include the DNAPL extraction, but it would also add an added step of what's called in situ treatment. It just means that you're treating something in place, so you're not extracting anything, you're treating in place. This ISCO, which is called in situ chemical oxidation, it involves injecting different types of chemical reagents into the ground to try to knock down the contaminant levels and get them to degrade faster than if you had, say, a standard pump and treat system. So these ISCO technologies have been proven at other Superfund sites. The challenge would be like you have to do an investigation to find where your hot spots are and to find where you're going to get the best bang for your buck with these treatment technologies. But we feel that the combination of this would be tackling sort of like source removal and really targeting the source area, hitting it head on. And again, we feel this, by doing so, that would have sort of a cascade effect on the down gradient plume by, not giving it, feeding it with additional chemicals and additional contamination. And we also feel strongly that this can be done in phases. So, we can start with an investigation phase and we can potentially work on the DNAPL extraction piece, and then we can look at the ISCO. So we feel like this is something that we have some flexibility where we can do this and have it funded in phases, which I think could work well. This particular cost is, and I know these numbers sound pretty large, but it's $20.5 million altogether. And again, some of the cost assumptions that I'm talking about, they're actually outlined in what's called this feasibility study report, which I totally recognize is very long and no one wants to read a 600-page report, but we do have a table of contents, so if you ever wanted to go and say, well, where did they come up with some of these numbers, you can see how some of these estimates were done on some of these figures. So another remedy that we looked at was doing, again, source area treatment, but adding in a component of groundwater pump and treat as a polishing step. So after you do ISCO and injecting chemicals to try to knock down levels, you can actually build a groundwater pump and treat system, which would extract the groundwater out and treat it and discharge it. Again, these tend to have higher operating costs and longer operations and maintenance costs for the state. So we kind of took that into consideration. You can see, so this is a little bit higher price tag at $35.3 million. Okay. The next remedy focuses, so we have two more remedies that we looked at that involve, so this particular one, GW8, involves doing in situ ISCO treatment with this groundwater pump and treat, but also doing ISCO treatment in that plume area, so say like areas that are away from the former manufacturing areas, potentially areas in like downtown Ashland and closer to the Sudbury River. And again, because you're looking at a lot more treatment areas and a lot more investigations that would have to be done ahead of time to target your treatment areas. This also has a little bit higher of a price tag to it, $56.8 million. And again, I'll talk a little bit about some challenges, working in areas of like high density and private property toward the end. The final remedy we looked at would again just be strictly doing, well, we would still be looking at the DNAPL extraction because that GW2 remedy I talked about sort of carries through to all the other remedies after it. So besides DNAPL extraction, this last remedy that we looked at was basically focusing on this ISCO in situ treatment in both the source area where the former manufacturing had occurred and then also in this down gradient plume area. So areas in the downtown area. And this doesn't have the groundwater pump and treat component, so it's a little bit less than GW8, so it has a price tag of $43 million. So, yes, the next one. So our proposed remedy, which is the GW4, we feel like it kind of uses a combination of just proven technologies, because to just get at this residual DNAPL, these pools of chemicals that we know still exist, but we haven't always been able to find in the past. But we just are trying to reduce this flux of contamination from the source area into the groundwater plume. And again, we do want to kind of just reduce these levels to reduce the groundwater exposure and the vapor intrusion risk. Okay, this is kind of an overview of where the target treatment areas would be. And again, one of our biggest challenges is the railroad tracks. There could potentially be some contamination sitting under the railroad tracks, but we're trying to figure out, how can we look at that further with, can we do horizontal drilling techniques to get as close as possible, or to get under buildings, or to get into areas maybe where we couldn't have done that like 10 or 15 years ago, or even 20 years ago. Then we also have a little bit of a hot spot here on the northeast slope of the landfill that we would be targeting for additional treatment here. And this is just kind of like a closer view. These little blue dots are the injection locations of where we could potentially inject those ISCO, these reagents that would be capable of maybe knocking down some of the contaminant levels. And then again, with that orange, we had kind of like limited access, obviously, under buildings and where the railroad tracks are. And here, because we do have the landfill, the side of the landfill cap, we don't want to disrupt that too much, but again, these are kind of our target zones of where this remedy would focus. Okay, so again, this is just kind of some of the reasons why we feel like this is our preferred alternative, because again, we feel like it addresses the areas where we feel the residual contamination still lies. Again, these are some proven technologies that have worked at other Superfund sites, both private and federal sites. We can implement this and fund it in kind of a phased approach. And we can also, implement, along with the engineered controls, potentially these institutional controls, just to make sure that we're reducing the groundwater exposure risk. And some of this, we do have, like I mentioned, some site challenges. We do have a very interesting fractured bedrock geology. It just means that the subsurface just has a lot of fractures in it, where unfortunately contamination can sink down into, and that's not uncommon in New England to have a very highly fractured bedrock network below like all of your till deposits and all of your surface deposits. We also, of course, have these railroad tracks that kind of dissect the site, and there's, of course, concerns of doing anything too close to these tracks, because we certainly don't want to undermine the Worcester line. We don't want to make sure people can still get to Boston, right? And then work that could be done in the down gradient area, what we call our down gradient plume. Even if we're not doing active treatment there, if we want to put wells in there and expand, because we've got to do performance monitoring for any of these remedies. In the past, we have had some challenges in getting property access. People don't necessarily want like a well on their property. They don't want a treatment point on their property. And, I can understand that as a homeowner. So, some of these remedies too that we looked at, we also took the property access and the private property factor really into consideration, because we just weren't sure that some of that was going to be feasible. But I will say that when we had to put in a couple of new shallow groundwater monitoring wells about a year ago, the town was very supportive, and they allowed us to put one into right, like sort of at the intersection of Water Street and Pleasant Street, which was great. We were able to put another well on the Ashland Historical Society property, because we were trying to look at some shallower concentrations as the plume was nearing the Sudbury River. So we really appreciate, again, the town's cooperation with a lot of the investigations and our feasibility study work that we've had so far. So. And again, this is just kind of a reminder that we have this public comment period that runs through February 14th. And again, during the hearing tonight, we can answer the informal questions first, and then we also will have be able to accept formal oral comments. We have a lot of really, really updated site information available right now. We just did our 5-year review, which is our very, very intensive look at any new data that we have for the site within the last 5 years. And that was done in May 2019. So we have, a lot of monitoring that our contractor did. We have a lot of the results of that Mass DEP did for their operations and maintenance monitoring. So the 5-year review also gives a lot of background for people that want to know more about what was done to mitigate the immediate risks that had been, that existed back in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So we feel the 5-year review is a great way for people to learn more about the site, and also to get like the most updated data that we have for the Nyanza Superfund site. Okay, and then again, the proposed plan is available on our website, or if you did need a copy emailed to you or something, we can certainly accommodate that. Just let us know at the end of the meeting. Okay, so I guess now we're going to take some questions about maybe some of these will be our informal questions, okay? And please feel free to come up to the podium, and don't feel afraid to ask any questions, like no.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. My name is Steve Mitchell. I serve on the select board in Ashland. So my question is, well, we're back a little bit. I certainly understand that cost and funding is always a consideration with these determinations. And I know that the EPA is also being challenged with their mission or impacted with the current administration. So we understand that. My question goes to why GW4 rather than GW5? Both of those plans don't have active treatment for the down gradient plume area. They provide for monitoring only, but GW5 has a much more aggressive approach to the air conditioning Nyakol site. And one of the pieces of information that you did not provide in your overview is the amount of time that it will take to reach your acceptable target remediation goals. Mm-hmm. And so GW4 is, I think, 275 years. GW5 is 140 years to reach those targets. So that, in essence, is my question. Cost aside, mm-hmm. Why 4 over 5?
Well, I know GW5, putting in a groundwater treatment plant, a lot of it was also to the availability of land. We did not feel that there was a lot of adequate space where we could actually put a groundwater treatment plant. And when you're also pulling groundwater up and treating it, it has to be discharged somewhere. So it either would have to go to a wastewater treatment plant, and the uncertainty of whether we would ever get a permit from, I believe, Ashland's on MWRA. I just don't know if they would allow, us to potentially discharge to the MWRA. So I know that's a factor. And I think in the past, when they've thought about a groundwater treatment plant, a lot of it's been the space consideration and also the effectiveness of it. I mean, there have been some treatment. For example, there's a treatment plant running at a federal facility site that I can think of for 25, 30 years, and quite frankly, the contamination of the chlorinated VOCs hasn't come down that much. It's like a very, very slow cleanup process. So the Air Force, for example, is actually now looking at doing these ISCO technologies because they can knock down these levels much faster than a groundwater treatment plant can. And then just sort of the long-term operating costs, we just question whether, in general, I think EPA is kind of taking a look at is just, do these groundwater treatment plants, are they really a cost-effective and just sort of like in general, from a cleanup perspective, are they really that effective in the long term?
Hi,
Hi.
My name is Joel Arbeitman. I have a number of questions. The first one is, I think a lot of us may be shocked to learn that there are still problems here on the site. At least my impression was that a tremendous amount of work was done back in the late 80s, early 90s. And, I had met with previous project managers. I mean, I had a lot of confidence in you guys. Mm-hmm. But it seems that there are still apparently fairly substantial problems, not by the scope of the area, but the importance that you're bringing to this by needing to do further cleanup is not immaterial. There are some risks here. Mm-hmm. So what I was hearing in your presentation, and correct me if I'm not getting this right, but mm-hmm. that you had been seeing good progress, the underground sources of contamination appeared to be maybe diminishing over time, but that became stabilized and not at a good level. Why are you addressing this now, and could this have been addressed 10, 15, 20 years ago, even seeing declining levels? Apparently, the risk was even greater then than it is now. There was more of it. That's your assessment. So I don't understand. That would be my first question is, why is this happening? Why did this take so long to really get in and clean up our town here? So that would be my first question.
Yeah, like I said, I know originally back in the 90s, the most imminent risk was the exposure to whatever's above ground. So, your sediments, your soils, there were buried drums. Those are all things that needed to be addressed first. And I think, for some reason, people were drinking this groundwater. People would have thought a little bit differently about it. Back in the mid-2000s, the biggest thing this groundwater was causing here was this vapor, intrusion risk. And that's why they did sort of an extensive indoor air testing program. And they felt at that time that, it could take years to clean up the groundwater. So how do we prevent people from, having vapors coming into their homes? So I know that these vapor mitigation systems were identified, and, those were not like a cheap method, but it's like, let's try to immediately like mitigate some of this risk to people. I guess similar to if you find out your house has, a really high concentration of radon over it, you want to get something to take away that risk as quickly as possible. Again, I've only been on the site for a couple of years, so I don't really know all of the history and the decision making that would have gone on like 10 or 15 years ago. But again, I think kind of what I mentioned a little bit earlier is just in the past 10 or 15 years, things have come a long way as far as technologies that didn't exist before. So I know at not just this site, but at other sites as well, groundwater cleanup has always been a bit of a challenge. And again, we've had, these groundwater treatment plants at some Superfund sites that have been operating for decades, and they really haven't showed like significant progress. So I feel that the groundwater piece of Superfund cleanup is just one of the most challenging. And again, the biggest thing too is just where's the risk coming from? If people aren't drinking it, like say they are down on Cape Cod with private wells or something, people are not ingesting it. Mark Gorham has confirmed that, nobody has a private well that he knows of, and that there's restrictions for if you wanted to put in a private well. So we felt confident that I think that no one's drinking the water, but where are the risks coming from? And the sort of the construction worker and the utility risk of like coming into, if someone's excavating and they're coming into contact with some shallow groundwater, that's kind of been identified as like a bit of a newer risk that we're trying to mitigate. But again, I think the indoor air issue was sort of the most pressing thing that we had to address for this. But I don't know if Lynn, if you want to add to that, or
Why don't you ask your second question?
yeah.
Okay, my other question is, and it's kind of a statement with a question behind it. I feel very confident that there's nobody in this room, and if somebody disagrees, they can come up and speak to it, who doesn't want this site cleaned up as thoroughly and completely and quickly as it possibly can be. So during your presentation, you raised the issue of the cost, and my inference from what you said was that you're trying to balance the costs with the perceived benefits or the hoped-for benefits and so on. And personally, while I understand that, I mean, we all have to deal with the financial realities and whatever constraints there are, I don't want to hear it. I want to know if somebody here was a billionaire and could drop as much money on this project as you asked for, what's the way to get this cleaned up as quickly and thoroughly as possible? And I don't think from your presentation that it's the option you're choosing.
Well, I think first of all, we have to come up with a final decision document. We cannot, this is what's called a fund lead site, so we don't have, there isn't a responsible party at this point paying for this. So we have to come up with a final decision document, this record of decision document. And until we do that, we can't apply for and compete with other Superfund sites for design money and remediation money. So by moving forward with what we think is both, a potentially technologically effective and cost-effective option, that's how we can kind of come to a point where we can actually move forward with different phases of this particular remedy. I don't know if that.
I just want to add one more comment to that. More costly doesn't necessarily mean more effective or faster. One of the things that Lisa emphasized, there are a lot of factors, there's 9 actually official factors in the law that we have to consider, and implementability and effectiveness are just as important as cost, frankly. So there were technical issues that prohibited us from selecting some of the more expensive alternatives. It wasn't that they were more effective necessarily. And in this particular one, we think this is the right balance of those alternatives.
Lisa, thank you for what you've been saying. Just a quick follow-up on what Joel had just brought up. I just have a concern also about the timeline in that, well, the present federal administration is not particularly sweet on the EPA and its work, and I'm concerned about longer term if that continues in any way. Will there be funding for this, like is something locked in? But the question I really stood up to ask was for a sense of perspective. Now, I know you don't know exactly how much we're talking about, but I'm wondering, what's the best estimate of the volume of the DNAPL and the aqueous phase liquids of concern in this project?
Yeah, I don't know if we necessarily have, because there were not necessarily great records. There's been we've kind of tried to estimate some of the mass, but because we don't have any particularly definitive records of exactly how many chemicals were used and what was properly disposed of versus what was dumped, it's kind of hard to tell that. So that's part of a little bit of the challenge, is that we don't exactly know. So we had this vault, for example, and it may be X amount of thousands of gallons, but this thing was not ever properly maintained. It would overflow, it would be full, it would be not full. So, we don't really know for sure the exact volume, but we know based on the groundwater levels that there is more, and the fact that we have been able to pull up, some hundreds of gallons with these extraction systems, so we know there's more there. Unfortunately, we do feel like it is spread out, and there are these bedrock features that it could be sitting in, potentially even under the railroad tracks, that it may or may not be accessible. So again, there are definitely some site challenges, but again, the closer we move toward a remedy, the more in a final decision document, the more we feel that we can, kind of address some of this residual contamination.
I just want to respond to your question about the funding. Interestingly, our funding in Superfund has remained level even with this administration. We've got the exact same amount of money this year as we had in, the previous administration. So that's good.
Very.
One thing to note, this administration is actually like very supportive of reuse too, like land reuse. So for example, the solar array that was put, it's a good reuse of a space that you're not going to probably put a soccer field on a Superfund landfill, but structurally the landfill was determined that we could have a solar array on this. So I think our administration also feels that the more you can clean up sites, the more they can be economically redeveloped, and in this case, Nyanza renewable energy, which we feel is a good thing.
Okay, good evening, Mark DeSoni. I appreciate you making your appearance and coming here and explaining what's happening. I came here to say comments, but can I comment and ask questions at the same time? Okay, so I wanted to say thank you to the town management and board health director for bringing everybody together on this. And I do have some comments that I'd like to ask questions on back and forth. It says, since the 2006 cleanup, the EPA and Mass Deep has been inspecting without fail to see groundwater chemical data. What are those data?
I'm sorry, could you just, when you did that?
Groundwater, since 2006, the cleanup by EPA and Mass DEP has been inspecting the groundwater chemicals. What's been updated on that?
Inspecting the groundwater chemicals. Do you mean the groundwater monitoring?
Yes.
Is that what you mean? Oh, okay.
Yes.
We actually, have some data reports that are available in what's called the administrative record. So the largest report we had, like the most comprehensive, was from 2015. And then we also did some additional groundwater monitoring in 2017 and 18 to get some more updated data on some key monitoring well for the feasibility study. So we have a data monitoring report for that. And the 5-year review that I had mentioned too, that actually has, within the last 5 years, which actually included the 2015 report. We have quite a few summaries and tables talking about some of the groundwater contaminant levels. And the state also conducts groundwater monitoring around the landfill. There's a number of monitoring wells that are not really associated with the plume, but more associated with the landfill. And that information is also summarized in that 5-year review too.
Okay, and for the institutional controls, are they involved, and can be said how those controls are working?
Did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a number of institutional controls for the property. Probably the one that's most prevalent is our vapor intrusion systems. We, basically, that's one control mechanism, but we also have controls on the property in the sense that if somebody were to use the property or areas where there is contamination, they would have to come and get our approval, much like what the solar array company had to do before they could put that solar project on the landfill. They had to follow the controls that are riding with the land, and it requires our approval. We are working with the town on creating a more broader control with respect to groundwater to basically prevent people from using the water for irrigation purposes, things like that. So the institutional controls are broad in what they do, and they really just try to prevent people from being exposed or doing things that interfere with the remedy that's already in place.
And propose public to the community plan for the operational tool for data and DNAP needs to be concise and constantly looked at. And the field scale pilot is mostly to stay on with the feasibility field study. Can that be talked on?
So the DNAPL data, we have these, so because we have these two test extraction system, what's getting pulled up out of there gets tested to see what the chemical makeup is. And we have some of those extraction reports. They do them annually in this administrative record that we set up for the proposed plan. Basically, like I said, it's a mix of chemicals that it tends to have TCE and the chlorobenzenes. So it's a compilation of chemicals. So they'll typically have that tested when they pump out the tanks at the Worcester Air Conditioning and the Nyakal extraction systems.
And yes, the human threat is still there.
Yeah, so, well, we feel like these vapor mitigation systems, these were kind of put in as I guess we consider like a short-term or a interim measure to kind of mitigate vapor intrusion risks. But there are some challenges with those because the state does operation maintenance on those systems, and they have to get access to people's properties, and their contractor has to get access to people's properties to look at these systems to verify they're still operating. So people can refuse to do that. People can turn them off if they so choose, but thankfully we haven't had that case, and there have been a couple properties that we hadn't gotten access to in several years and then got access to again. And thankfully, fingers crossed, they were still running. But again, this was a measure to kind of, mitigate the immediate risk. But we know, like in the long term, ideally, we want to knock down the groundwater. And we have these cleanup goals, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there may not even be a vapor intrusion risk. We may be able to mitigate that before we even reach these really low cleanup levels. So, you could have TCE in the groundwater at a level that's higher than what we're proposing for remediation goals, and we may test the indoor air in homes and businesses and say, oh, there isn't a vapor intrusion risk. So that's why, again, this particular remedy, we feel like we don't necessarily, we have some options to kind of like evaluate our progress as we go along, and not necessarily have to reach every single cleanup level that we have. We may be able to mitigate the risks before we do that.
I just want to follow up a little bit when you said the health threat, there's still a health threat. It's not exactly correct in that. In order to have a health threat, you have to have an exposure. So the soil itself that was contaminated, that's been covered over and capped, there's no exposure. Nobody can become exposed to that soil. The groundwater, nobody's drinking it, so nobody's exposed to it. The vapor intrusion piece is what Lisa was just talking about. We've taken measures to basically dissipate, so whatever comes into those houses is not contaminated. So right now, there is no exposure, so there is no health threat, which is part of the reason why, there was an earlier question about why aren't we getting this done? Our efforts on this site have really been focused on actual health threats when they were there. At one time, the soil did pose a current threat. The groundwater posed a current threat. The sediments in the stream posed a threat. So through the history, we've been dealing with those. And now there are no current threats. The groundwater itself, yes, it continues to threaten the groundwater down gradient, and it continues to require us to use these vapor mitigation systems. Our hope is, by taking this, the remedy that we've put in place here, is that we will no longer in the future need those vapor mitigation systems. So that is our goal. That is really the crux of why we're taking this action now. We're hoping it's the final, but it may not be the final. We may need to do additional stuff here.
And one more comment, and then a last one.
This last
one.
Yeah.
Last one. And the environmental threats that you have reported on If nobody's read it, how important is that to read?
Would you say environmental threats like to the river or?
On the air, ground, everything.
Well, there's different risk assessment reports that we do have like publicly available. You know, we have risk assessment reports for the mercury in the Sudbury River. We've got risk assessment reports for indoor air. We've got, you know, previous risk assessment reports that were done before a lot of the, you know, really bulk of the cleanup's done. So, you know, it just kind of depends how much people want to read. But, you know, risk assessments do play a big factor because without risk, you know, we really don't have a basis for doing cleanup actions at a Superfund site, so.
And my last thing to say, no matter what.
Actually, that was your last one. You can, let's give other people.
Yeah, we just
And
have
then
a line
there's going to be
behind
another
you.
opportunity. There's going to be one.
Less than a sentence, less than a sentence. No matter what the cost is, it's worth it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Mike Mazurik. I live on Pleasant Street. I was wondering, you keep on saying this groundwater may pose no health risk, but I live at a high water table and everything washes down to the point where a 20-foot by 30-foot pool right off the back of the railroad tracks washes up into my backyard. Is that not a health risk for my children? Should I keep them away from that? I wasn't aware that we had a high plume area underneath our house. This is kind of new light to me and maybe to most of the people in here, I'm not sure. Maybe my ignorance for not looking it up thoroughly, but does this propose any sort of health risk to my animals, to my kids? It's right next to my swimming pool. I mean, it washes up into my backyard.
Well, is that from I know that we've had some complaints about Keolis put in some drainage trenches along the tracks.
They don't maintain them and everything washes up into my backyard. No other, I got the wetlands right behind me. And it comes right up. I'm like 50 feet from that chemical river you talk about.
Yeah, the chemical
right
pump, yeah.
next to Worcester AC, and it washes up into my backyard.
So I believe this issue was looked at previously, but it's something that we could certainly take a closer look at. So why don't you, at the end of the night, come over and give us your address, and we'll be in touch with you. We could certainly, you know, sample the stuff that's in your backyard. But I know there's been other properties where we've done this, and we haven't found a problem. So what is there is not the contaminated stuff. The stuff that's highly contaminated actually is very deep. So it's unlikely that that stuff is coming up into your yard. But, you know, when somebody raises something like this, it's always worth us doing a double check, and we're happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, an inch of rain brings it in, so it's a very high water table, so I'm
Yeah.
not sure how deep you need to go to get to these contaminants, but
Yeah,
again, I have kids that play back
Sure.
there, my pool's right
Yeah.
there.
Sure.
I just don't know what kind of risk it poses for them, my animals, myself.
Yeah,
Yes,
once we
it's-
know the address, we can look more closely at your particular situation. But, you know, my guess is we've had a few of these before that we've gone out and checked and not seen any issues. So I'd be very surprised, but it's always worth us doing a double check.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Rob St. Germain. My compliments in trying to deal with a very difficult situation with many unknowns. Did I understand on the preferred solution that you'll be doing some injecting? Yes. And so groundwater, of course, is very unpredictable, and given the geology which you mentioned this evening, it makes it even more so. So my question is this. As you start injecting, what is the chance that you are actually going to exacerbate the situation and raise the risk?
So as far as the ISCO treatment, it gets injected quite deep, and it typically degrades concentrations pretty quickly. I have not heard of any instances at other Superfund sites where they've done ISCO injections and it's ever exacerbated. It's actually the opposite. It actually starts to degrade like these persistent chemicals pretty quickly. So one of the things that we plan to do, though, is have, you know, a very extensive monitoring well program and network just to monitor the performance and determine, you know, is it possible that the plume could spread into areas where it wasn't before, or could some of the residual contamination, you know, be pushed into another area? But that would all be part of like the performance monitoring. But again, you know, the results that we've seen with ISCO at other federal facility sites that also are, bounded by different residential neighborhoods. It's been very successful. It's actually significantly reduced concentrations rather than, causing an additional problem or causing something to be exasperated. So that's one of the reasons why we're saying it's a proven technology.
Hi. I want to preface this by saying that this isn't meant to be a criticism. It's a question. That your emphasis seems to be on chemical levels. And, I mean, you are the Environmental Protection Agency, so chemicals are sort of your bailiwick. It strikes me that it would also be interesting to have numbers from a public health perspective or an epidemiological perspective to see, I think, what most of us are concerned about, and that is the health of Ashland citizens. Do you have any information on that?
There have been, recently for this feasibility study, like we did an additional health risk study that for, scenarios that we hadn't been done before, and one of them was a construction worker scenario, is that if a construction worker dug to a particular depth and they came exposed to TCE, would there be a carcinogenic risk? Would there be a non-carcinogenic risk to any organs? So we did do that as part of the feasibility study. But yeah, there have been quite a few, especially for the indoor air, and that was the last one that I know of was in 2005. That was done after some extensive indoor air testing. And again, when we identified the potential construction worker risk of being in a trench, where vapors, you could come into contact with vapors or shallow groundwater, that's where we looked at, and we actually did not find that TCE would cause a carcinogenic risk. In that case, that was, I think they determined it was going to be like a risk to kidneys or some organs.
But what you're talking about is a little bit different than my question. That is, how many people have become ill that maybe go beyond what the norms are?
Yeah, there was a health study for a while back.
The cancers created were from Nyanza.
Yeah, because again,
EPA
when
is involved.
there was, as Lynn mentioned, when there was a really high exposure, when you had sediments and soils that were readily available to people, and if kids were playing in them, unfortunately, we know that people did get exposed to some,
I know, but my question still is there any ongoing, is there a Department of Public Health looking at it?
Right, there's not now. Yeah, there's nothing through the state or anything like that, right?
Yeah, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. In order to have a risk, an ongoing risk, you need to have an ongoing exposure. And there are none right now. That's the point.
But I think you need to be cautious in making that statement. Just earlier, Lisa said that, with new technology, we found things that we didn't know about in the past. And so that means maybe that risk still exists that we don't know about. All I'm really saying is, it seems like when you're looking at chemicals, the people part should be also considered equally. And that's all.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kara Terrell.
Hello.
And that's a good segue because I do want to speak with the people that have been impacted in this town. I'm representing and part of Ashland Citizens Action Committee. We started to get involved in 2015. I grew up in Ashland. I work in Ashland. I raised my kids in Ashland. So I did think that most of this toxic waste was cleaned up. So as an adult, to find out in 2015 that there was going to be building around this area, it was a shock to many of us. And we were horrified, so we became involved and tried to prevent any disruption to the CAP, to the site, to any of this area, because we do believe there is a risk. And as we started to get involved, and we talked to you, Lisa, and you were involved as well, we realized that there was still more work to be done, and there was more toxic waste it was an active waste site still in many areas. And our concern and our request was that this feasibility be started. So I just want to make sure that it's clear, not to take any credit for this, but to really be clear that this was a citizens' action. And this is what motivated you guys to get involved again. Once your involvement became started, the town was very supportive of this. They were involved in this. We did have to sue them, but that was before that. But after that, everybody was involved, and we were able to move forward. But we just want to really talk about that this is an emotional issue for people in town, and it's hard to believe that there's no risk anymore. I understand there's no open contamination, but something like Chemical Brook, if a kid was over there and was in that area, they could touch it.
Well, like Chemical Brook, though, was excavated as deep as they could go without undermining, then they were concerned about undermining the tracks.
Right.
But there, there is a liner down
Right,
on
but when
top of
the-
what's there,
When the selectmen went over to check it, the liner was off, all the bedrock was off.
Well, now the state inspects that. Here's the one thing that we have had an issue with in the past, Keolis, and I hate to keep mentioning them, but sometimes they do work around the tracks, and they are supposed to notify DEP when they're there.
It doesn't matter the reason, I'm
Yeah.
just
So,
expressing that there is a
that
risk.
There
There is
could
a
be
risk.
some instances where parts of Chemical
Okay.
Brook, and it's very frustrating, but I will say Jennifer McQueenie has done a really good job at being on top of Keolis and telling them, look, you need to tell us when you are going to do work near the tracks.
There's
Like
a
they
lot
were
of
going to
people-
put in
right.
these PTC poles for that new technology, and it was like we were suddenly an afterthought, like, oh, we're going to put in these poles by the tracks, and it's like, thankfully, we were able to intercept it and find out that they were putting the poles on the opposite side of the tracks, not where we had Chemical Brook.
Yeah,
But
so whoever's responsibility is, it doesn't mean that it is no risk at
Yeah.
all. So there's still concerns.
Yeah.
We do want to have this cleaned up as much as we can. We would love it in our lifetime, but that's
Yeah.
probably not feasible. But I just want you to remember that this is about our loved ones dying, our loved ones suffering from cancers, extreme cancers. I'm still getting emails, IMs, texts on a weekly basis telling me about a rare cancer that someone had. So this is still happening. My prom date died last year from a very rare cancer. All of us have suffered losses. So, when we look at somewhere like Howe Street, and that was disrupted from beavers. So some things happen that nobody can predict.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of unknowns, and we don't want to be the canary down the mine shaft anymore. We're going to keep ourselves safe, and we're going to keep on this, and we're glad that you are involved in this.
No, and I'm glad that you guys are involved. I know you were getting involved with Nyanza Advisory Committee, and
Yes, they
that
were
is very
also a big
helpful.
part of it.
And, and another thing is too, like if people see activities in a particular area that, that people are uncomfortable with or unfamiliar with, like we want to hear about it. The state wants to hear about it because, they do have a great inspection program, but can things happen that we don't know about? Absolutely. So we're glad to have the eyes and ears, and we know that there's a not so nice history here.
Yep, we'll
with
remain involved.
and-
Thank you.
and- Yep, appreciate it.
Gina Reyna from Thomas Road. I have, for the record, I'm on 3 different committees in the town, the Board of Health, Conservation Commission, as well as the Nyanza Committee. This is a follow-up question to the first gentleman, Steve Mitchell's question that he asked. The downside area, the question that he wanted to know why we are not doing more in it. The first question was you had the access issue. Have you approached the owners there to find out whether they will give access? And have they denied it? The follow-up question to that is that what sort of work area is needed for each of these injection sites?
So, because, we don't have like a full design or anything for, what would have theoretically could have occurred in the downgradient. But again, Lynn had mentioned that we take our remedies and we just compare them against, reasonable factors. And implementability is definitely one of them. And you also have to remember too, the downtown area of Ashland, it's very highly populated. There are a lot of utilities that we could potentially have challenges with. So looking at many of these factors, that was one of the things. And we also want to make sure that from funding perspectives, if we have too high of a cost of remedy, we want to make sure that we aren't, completely out of the game for getting money or funding for some of this work. So, so again, in the feasibility study, it does kind of get into a little bit more detail about how they looked at each remedy and how we kind of determined what, would make the most sense and what would give us the most cost-effective and also the most technologically effective solution. But no, we never particularly approached the access issues I was referring to were when we were actually just trying to put some monitoring wells. There were just like several properties that we weren't even able to drill a monitoring well on. So, I mean, that's just like a bit of an indicator as to, you know, a lot of private properties really don't necessarily want to have Superfund remedial activities occurring on it. And like I said, I certainly don't fault people for that because, you know, as a homeowner, I don't know if I'd want someone putting a well or injecting something in my backyard either. So, you know, we're just kind of trying to be sympathetic. The least, you know, disruption to community is another one of our factors. And that was another thought I think we had, is this, the more we do in downtown, you know, we could be having more disruption to the community. And would it really be effective? And, you know, would it be worth the effort? So. Yeah.
The one thing about this remedy that we're actually picking, I want to point out, is that, you know, we're going to start focusing on the areas that are the highest contamination close to the site. But as we do that, if we learn that this is highly effective and we need to step out further, we will. That's the way we're going to structure this. It's going to be an adaptive management approach towards, you know, cleaning it, starting at the highest contamination and moving out, starting where it's easiest to get access and moving out. But the more properties we involve and the further out we get, the more complicated it becomes to implement this kind of remedy.
Yeah, I mean, this technology has been used in other states effectively using potassium permanganate as well as hydrogen peroxide.
Yep.
So that shouldn't be a difficult things to do here. The other thing is that if the technology is so good here that we can even reduce the size of each of these boring holes rather than just having a big holes. And I presume that you're not going beyond 4 or 5 inches of holes if you want these injection.
Yeah, no, we're going to do a design. We're going to do a design after. This was just a concept that we put up there with concept spacing. You know, once we pick this officially and get it approved, then we'll actually go out and decide, you know, through investigations, how close do we need them, how much, you know, spacing, you know, things like that. The other important point about this, so it's not like we're ignoring the down gradient. If you inject up gradient, it flows down gradient. So it will treat part of the down gradient aquifer. It's not like we're ignoring it.
Okay.
So.
Between accessing as well as keeping the monitors, for these, this is not going to be a permanent hole there for a long time to inject every time. It's going to be 1 or 2 times that they do it and then
Right,
close it
they
off.
usually they'll
Monitoring
do
wells
injections.
will stay there for long,
Yeah.
so that's why the access may be difficult from the private owners of monitoring
Yeah.
well, but this may be easier, so maybe attempt it.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yep,
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Carl Hackinson, and I'm on the Conservation Commission. And is it possible to go back a few slides to the areas of concern?
Oh, the list, or the
overlay.
the overview of the area
Yeah.
of concern? Okay, sure.
Yes.
Is this too?
No, I think it's like actually a little bit further up, yeah. That one.
That one, yeah.
Mhm.
The area that, can you point out with your laser pointer where the western wetlands and Trolley Brook are?
Oh, okay, so the western wetlands are here.
Is it the eastern wetlands then?
So the
That's
eastern
Trolley Brook?
wetland is here. This
Okay.
is where the significant, like,
And
excavation was done,
that
yeah.
was its own operable unit.
Yeah, that was operable unit 3, yeah.
Right, and that's outside of the area of concern, and it's the only area that
Mhm.
was in an operable unit that's outside the area of concern.
Mhm.
I was curious as to why that was. And the reason I'm
Yeah.
asking is because this plume area has been a challenging area to the Conservation Commission a number of times. And we've kind of been accused that we're stepping outside of our lane when we talk about this, but we're about as close to the lane as you can be for any group that's not the Board of Health. And so these mapped out areas are important. And that was its own area of concern originally in the remediation. And I'm curious as to why it's not in the area of concern now. Is that an area that's monitored?
It's based on like the monitoring well network, which I don't unfortunately have a slide of that, but the groundwater monitoring here and the historical data was pretty just mercury intensive here in the sediments. So the monitoring wells were showing that the contamination did not extend into the eastern wetlands. We'd actually asked our like in-house hydrogeologist, he's like a bedrock hydrogeology expert, if he thought for any reason, gee, do you think there could potentially be a volatile organic source here that's, not going this way, but maybe moving here? And he said, based on the fracture network and the orientation of the fractures and the groundwater flow direction, he did not feel that there was anything here based on the data, the groundwater data, the historical data, or the geology that, could lead us to believe there's something here that's, flowing into this down gradient area. So.
Okay.
But it's a valid question though, because we actually had that same question, yeah.
That wetland area is directly down gradient from where the original lagoons were. That's why I'm asking the question. And my second question, and it's really a little bit hard to see because of the overlay, but Magunko Road and that whole area, there are a lot of buildings in there, and there are a lot of parking areas and driveways. And I'm assuming that they weren't able to excavate beneath those buildings during the remediation period. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, is that you don't really know the true source of the continual DNAPL that's showing up in these wells. Is it possible, or do you know, whether underneath the buildings and underneath the road and underneath the driveways, you mentioned the railroad tracks, but those areas are more proximate to where the factory were than the railroad tracks are.
Yeah, that's true. I know that there are excavation, there's actually, like, as part of this GEAR, it's called this Grant of Environmental Restrictions and Easement, we don't want people excavating in these areas. And I don't know exactly the full history offhand. I'd have to look back at it. Like, did they drill through? I'm sure they probably did drilling through these areas. I wouldn't be shocked. I know that the biggest waste dumping had occurred, on this hill, which is now the landfill, and in here. But could there be something underneath? It's possible. I mean, we know deep down these chemicals have sunk down to the deepest levels of the bedrock, more than 30 feet into the ground. So whether there's residual soil contamination, it's possible, but with the restrictions that we have this IC in place currently, we are looking at, preventing people from excavating in this particular area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's been
What's that? Oh yeah, there's definitely, no, these are still areas of high concentrations, which is why we feel that this particular source area is important to look at.
But we've also put monitoring wells over there.
Yeah, oh yeah, and we have monitoring wells there too, yeah. Okay.
Thanks,
Hi, Michael.
Lisa. Hello, my name's Michael Herbert. I'm the town manager here. I want to reiterate some of the comments that were already said. Really appreciate you taking this seriously and really looking at a way to finally clean up this site, because I think we can all agree, and I think you join with us in this sentiment, that this isn't just about containing contamination. This is about cleaning it up, and we really do think we're making some positive steps towards that. I've got a couple of other comments, a couple of questions, and then a couple of pleas. First of all, in terms of the vapor mitigation systems, roughly how much do those cost to install and inspect?
They range from $10,000 to $100,000.
Okay, depending on the house and the ground, and okay. I would really just like to put in an ask here to see if we could expand the vapor mitigation system area. There's a level of comfort, I think, that goes with that, because I do think it's effective and it works. But, I know a couple of households on Forest Ave that are just right outside of the vapor mitigation area, but they are so close to where, well, they're right in the plume, but they're so close to where the source is. I think it would be really, really great if we give them the opportunity to put a system in as well. So that's number one. Number two, we've talked a little bit about institutional controls. I know there has been some concern relayed in the community about how that might impact downtown development and reinvestment in downtown and our own revitalization. I just want to let you know, and we've talked about this before, we fully support, or I fully support, whatever we need to do to make sure that any work done is safe. We've got some administrative controls that we have in place in terms of making applicants test, getting that information to the EPA, EPA giving us recommendations, us incorporating that into local conditions, local permits. We've utilized that twice. To formalize that would be really, really good. So we fully support that. Okay, so here comes the questions. So at what level and who decides how much is spent on this process and if it's a go or not? I'm assuming it's not at the regional level.
Depends on the cost of the remedy, actually. If it's under 50,000, I'm sorry, under 50 million, and that's not in total, each particular phase, if it's under 50 million, it is made at the regional level. If it's above the 50 million, we have to brief the administrator.
Okay.
So this one is not one that has to go to the administrator. We do brief headquarters on the proposed plan. They review it. They, sign off on what we're asking for or what we're proposing in the cleanup plan. Once we put this through, though, there's another whole process for actually getting the money. What we'll do after we select the remedies, we'll go into a design phase and we'll nail down the costs. These costs right now are plus or minus, 30%. Once we have a design, then we have to get in line. Get in line for funding. This is like Lisa said, there is not a responsible party here to pay for the cleanup. This comes out of the federal budget. We have right now in our region 6 sites, 6 of them, that have decisions have been made, designs are done, and they're on the shelf waiting for funding. So that's more or less how it works. And in order to get in line, we go before a national panel that looks at the threats being posed by the site, whether they're current or whether they're potential threats, and they rank the sites. I think totally there's about 43 sites on the national list waiting for funds. So although earlier some gentlemen asked about our funding, we've been receiving level funding for several years in Superfund. We still haven't received enough to implement all the cleanups that we've selected that need federal dollars to do them.
All right, thank you. And just to be clear, EPA is responsible for the capital costs associated with this. DEP, the state, would be responsible for the ongoing maintenance and operations of the site.
After a certain period of time, we turn it over to the state. So we do some operation and maintenance, but that at some point in time, we actually do transfer it over to the state, yes.
And then I know that the February 14th date is the end date for comments. Is there a way, people are going to be shocked to hear me say this because I'm probably the most impatient person here, but is there a way to extend that comment period?
Yeah, if we receive a request for, an extension and it's, reasonable, then we would consider that. It's not uncommon for us to extend it if people need more time.
And I think that's important. I appreciate that because I think this is one of those situations where we've got to get this right and not just necessarily get it done. And I think you share that with us. But I think we as a town need to figure out which of these remedies would be best for us, understanding the risks of getting it funded and things like that. And I think you feel the same way, and I think we would like to work together with you because you're going to be our advocates at that level. When you're in front of that panel, when you're in front of the people who are making these decisions, you're going to have to advocate for what this remedy is. So I really do think we need to take an opportunity as a community to figure out what would be best for us. And again, like I said, understand the risks involved and then find a way to work with you. But I do think we need to extend that comment period so that we can do that.
Okay. So I'd like to take this one more, question, and I'd like to actually flip this to the formal hearing where folks can come up and actually, give oral comments on the record. I won't respond to those. Those will get an official written response when we issue our final decision. But we'll take one more informal question.
My name is Amol Rani. I have a question regarding this.
Could you speak a little closer maybe to the,
Sure.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So my question is regarding the risk of vapor intrusion. So you said that you have the systems which are installed in place and they mitigate the risk of vapor intrusion. Okay. What I understood is the vapor intrusion systems are installed only in that pink area of concern. So are you saying that?
No, actually, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna go back to the original slide that kind of shows, okay, yeah, this,
Right. So,
this right here, this shaded area here is actually where we have systems installed currently.
okay, so what about the other houses in the town which are not very close to it? Even, do they stand at the risk of this vapor where the systems are not installed?
Yeah, so recently we had done some, additional, this particular property back in, I think it was 2015, had been tested twice. This is an industrial facility, and there were no indoor air issues identified. We tested some houses along here on Pleasant Street. We actually even tested, there was a church across from the town hall. And positively, we did not actually, we did not have any indoor air, TCE or the contaminants of concern detected in the indoor air. In some cases, we found low levels in the gas below like the slabs of the foundations, but not at a level that was causing a vapor intrusion risk. And something to remember too, when these were put in, the groundwater levels were significantly higher. And again, like I had mentioned, the groundwater levels kind of had somewhat degraded, but then stabilized. So while we do feel like there's a risk, there could even be potentially some houses within this vapor mitigation area, on the fringes even, that have systems that maybe they might no longer need them. But again, a lot of this would be part of our remedy too, is can we test, we would have to turn off the systems, and that would probably be part of some of our remedy testing. We would turn off the systems and then try to test them to see if there was still a risk. So it's not to say that we wouldn't put in more vapor mitigation systems if we found the need for them, but so far we haven't found the need for them. But again, the long-term monitoring of this risk is something that would be watching very closely as part of this remedy.
But are you going to consider some more samples in the area which is not in maybe outskirts of this area maybe?
Yeah, I mean, we have a regional laboratory in Chelmsford, EPA does, and we have some staff there that are kind of like experts in vapor intrusion and indoor air and subslab testing, and they go to Superfund sites all over New England. And typically when we want to do a sampling event, we can just put in a request to them, and they do an excellent job. Our risk assessors are very happy with their work, so we always have an opportunity. Not everybody wants their house tested. I just wanted to kind of make that a note. These things are voluntary. We can't force our way onto someone's property. Some people don't want their properties tested, and they have a right to say that, that they don't want it tested. But we try to encourage, we found 13 properties, including around Forest Avenue. Someone had mentioned that. We actually had ended up testing a bunch of some of these houses and where we could get access, and we were happy to find that we did not have a vapor intrusion risk identified outside of the immediate downtown area. So, but again, our sampling is only as good as like the access. Kind of look, it gets back a little bit to what I was saying earlier on that point. But thank you for your question. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to, you have one more question. Okay, one more question. I thought she had a comment. She wanted to make a statement. I'm sorry.
No, later I will add comments, but I did have a couple of questions.
Sure.
One of them is that it would need cooperation between the health and you all to initiate a health study, but a neurological health study. In all the years that this has been addressed, you have never had a neurological health study. And you know that mercury is a cause of neurological damage. I've been studying this for 50 years. I am no longer an official in the next town over, but I'm still interested. And I've always been curious. And one time when I was acting in an official capacity, I asked that we do a narrow study of the families we had identified who fished and took the fish home to our special needs children in the school classes. And there was a relationship. And the people at DEP and EPA almost went nuts when I suggested this. So I would suggest that Ashland try to get this started. They won't be doing it through you, but in relation to that and how they might do it, is there a TAG grant still available through this Superfund site? The last I knew, it was $75,000.
Yeah.
And that if a group got together and put together a 501(c) and made sure that there were no politicians on their board, that they could get $75,000 worth of expertise they could hire to help them go through this process.
So the way we give out TAG grants right now, I mean, we could certainly put you in the queue. It's $25,000 that we offer communities, and the intention of the TAG grant is to get independent expertise to understand our documents. With respect to doing a health study, that is something that we defer to the state on. They were the ones that did the previous health study. It's not something that EPA does. We're not mandated to. The funding that we receive is not under statute. We're allowed to do that kind of a study.
Well, there has been so much heartbreak within this community of people trying to do unofficial health studies and having them thrown out, that it seems to be a heartbreak here, and that the community deserves that kind of attention. And there have been so many times through the 50 years that I've been looking that you all have thought that everything was done. You were ready to walk away. And God bless the church ladies in that church, because they knew something was really wrong, and they put the pressure on and made sure that everybody didn't leave town thinking it was all over. And one more thing, you've talked about I call them the zines, the volatiles, and you've described how some of them sink, yes, and some of them approach the surface. And it's been explained to me over and over again how harmless it is when they get to the surface and they become airborne. And I fail to recognize them as harmless. And I fail to also accept the explanation that if the ones that like to get to the surface are in the groundwater, why that gentleman who had the pond in his yard coming would not have both kinds of zines in his pond, the kind that sink and the kind that come to the air. And yes, he should keep his animals and children away from that. Don't you agree?
So again, I think we've tested water in people's backyards and have not seen the Z's. That's hard data that we've done. I'm certainly willing to look at this gentleman's yard and take another look. When people have these concerns, we go out and we test and we verify where the contamination is. It certainly has to be shallow to come up into people's backyards. What we're dealing with and addressing in this remedy is the deeper contamination. The contamination that we're going after now is the deep stuff. It's not the stuff that's coming up into people's backyards, because I don't believe that's a current viable pathway. If it was, I think we would have found it previously.
Well, I applaud you for going after the deep things. I urge you to go after all of the contaminants within these borders that you've drawn and outside. And the next town over is very concerned, because if you leave anything out of this process, it's all going to end up in our backyard.
My point being, when I say we're going at the deep, is that there's nothing in the shallow. That's the point. The point is where we're going after it. The higher concentrations are down deep. We didn't bring a figure tonight, and we can certainly release a figure that shows a cross-section so you can get a better understanding for what it looks like under the ground. Right now, we're just looking at it in an aerial perspective. But the worst of the stuff that we're going after is sunk deep, and that's why, you know, when we sample, you can actually see the shallow stuff is not contaminated. The stuff closer to the site, that's true, but down gradient, it's not as shallow.
I have one last question.
Okay.
The concentration has always been on the lining of the cap, which is wonderful. However, you're looking at that and not looking under, and it's my understanding that the dump itself is not lined. And so you can't expect anything but action in water going through an area, carrying things through it and out of it naturally. Doesn't need the rain coming down straight through, but just the natural flow of groundwater.
I just wanted to make one quick note there at the base, the southern end of the landfill, there is a massive trench, and that is a diversion trench for groundwater and surface water. You know, anything that's going to fall on the cap, it's not going to be able to get through that liner. So the design, the Army Corps of Engineers, they installed this huge trench specifically to ensure that the groundwater flows around the cap and not through the cap. So that was part of the original, and again, we have this information too, like in the.
But you know that you can't control water to that length.
Right, but they engineered it to the point that they could control it as best as possible. And I have literally been inside that trench and observed groundwater seeping out, running through the trench, and it goes into, detention ponds. And, so basically we are doing our best to try to divert clean groundwater and surface water away from the cap. And, I think the Army Corps of Engineers did a good job at putting that in. It's actually even larger than it needs to be, but I'm really glad that it's there because it does prevent and intercepts groundwater flow as it's coming onto the cap. So I just did want to make a note of that when you were talking about groundwater flow.
That is a massive attempt to control that. However, I hope that the town will recognize that there is no lining on the floor of that dump, and that we can only expect more to flow out of it, and you can't capture it all. And I applaud Ashland for being willing to talk about this and to be curious about this and not try to hide it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. So I'd like to now start the official public hearing for this evening. I'm going to have to start a little formally because we're going to have this part of it recorded. So again, my name is Lynn Jennings. I'm the EPA section chief for the Massachusetts Superfund section in Boston. I will be the hearing officer for tonight's hearing on the proposed cleanup plan for the Nyanza Superfund site in Ashland. The purpose of this hearing is to formally accept oral comments on the proposed plan that was released to the public on January 14th. As a reminder, the public comment period runs until February 14th. As noted earlier, EPA has a stenographer here tonight to record comments. We will not be responding to the comments received during the formal hearing, but will respond to them in writing after the close of our comment period. For the record, the proposed plan includes continued operation of the two existing dense non-aqueous phase liquid extraction systems at the Nyakal and Worcester air conditioning parcels, continued operation of the 41 existing vapor mitigation systems in buildings down gradient from the site, pre-design investigations to locate additional dense non-aqueous phase liquids, and if found, installation of new extraction wells, in situ chemical oxidation treatment targeted for contamination in the deep overburden and shallow weathered bedrock. The overall remedy will also include land use controls to protect the remedy where unrestricted use standards are not achieved, long-term monitoring and maintenance, and periodic 5-year reviews to ensure the protectiveness of the remedy. The total estimated cost for this proposed remedy is approximately $20.5 million. Those of you wishing to comment should have indicated your desire to do so by signing up on the sign-in sheet. When called upon, please state your name and address or your affiliation. If there are any others who would like to enter a comment but did not sign up, we'll take your comments after folks on the sign-up sheet have offered their comments. After all the comments have been heard, I will close the formal hearing. If you wish to submit written comments, you can hand them to Zanetta or Lisa or myself, or you can mail or fax them or email them to the address in the plan. At the conclusion of the hearing, please see any of the EPA representatives if you have any questions on how to submit comments. All oral comments that we received tonight and the written comments that we received during the comment period will be addressed in a responsiveness summary and become part of the administrative record for the site and will include with the site's cleanup and will be included with the site's cleanup decision. So thank you for coming this evening. Public input is an important factor in EPA's decision-making process. We will now begin the formal hearing. I don't know if you guys are still here, but I'm going to go through, starting with Dan Borelli. Yes. Thank you.
I'm going to have another commenter is going to join me, Kara.
You can take me off the list on that.
You don't want to go twice?
No.
Okay.
Thank you. My name's Dan Borelli. I grew up in Ashland, but currently live in Framingham.
Kara Terrell. And we're here to represent Ashland Citizens Action Committee. And we just want to talk a little bit about some of the concerns that we still have. We all joined together to continue to petition for further work done in Ashland. We say continue because there has been a series of citizen action groups over decades from this town, and we honor and respect their efforts by taking on the responsibility of continuing to advocate for a clean Ashland.
With this in mind, we thank the EPA for this thorough and digestible document. What is found within this document is a new set of knowledge about Nyanza. Specifically on page 9, second paragraph, the first sentence states, and I quote, EPA has determined that there are both current and future potential threats to human health, end quote. And it goes on to specify that the source of that threat is DNAPL in the groundwater, known as the plume. This is the first instance where the EPA has publicly conveyed that the plume is identified as a threat.
Again, on page 14, second paragraph, it states, and I quote, although EPA has not established a threshold level of toxicity risk to identify a principal threat waste, generally where toxicity and mobility combine to pose a carcinogenic risk of 10 to 3 or greater, the source material is considered principal threat waste. Residual DNAPL within the NIACL, WAC, AOC is acting as a continuing source of contamination to the contaminated groundwater plume and is considered principal threat waste, end quote.
So let's go back to that first sentence. It states toxicity and mobility. So toxicity is a contamination in the plume, and mobility is us. That is humans traversing the land on top of the plume.
The next paragraph on page 14 then states, and I quote, it is EPA's current judgment that the preferred alternative identified in this proposed plan is necessary to protect public health or welfare or the environment from actual or threatened releases of hazardous substances, including principal threat waste, into the environment, and that treatment of the principal threat waste has been included as a component of the preferred alternative to the extent practicable, end quote.
So we'd like to take this moment to commend the EPA for making their findings so clearly understandable and presenting them tonight to us in this public venue. Your findings affirm our position, which is one of continued vigilance to ensure the safety and health of Ashland citizens. And so now we have a few questions and statements.
Please consider our vigilance as our commitment to the overall health cleanup efforts. We'd like to be included as much as possible in how your ongoing work is made public to Ashland. The first question, on page 1, you state that the pre-design investigation, the PDI, will look into other sources of DNAPL beyond the current array of monitoring wells. How far and wide will you place these new monitoring wells?
Number 2, using the relatively new method of in situ chemical oxidization, ISOC, How will residents know when and where this work will be conducted?
Number 3, what are the 21st century communication methods by which a citizen can learn and be continuously updated from your work on the site?
Number 4, is there a way that we could have a live feed of the ongoing remediation work?
Lastly, and in the event of an emergency of a potential release of the toxicity either by human error during remediation or from an extreme weather event like a flood, etc., how and when will citizens know if the site has been compromised?
So to conclude, we simply want to know as much as possible, as soon as possible. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next I'd like to call Stephen Mitchell.
For the record, my name is Steve Mitchell. I reside at 5 Newcastle Road, and I serve on the Ashland Board of Selectmen. My family moved to Ashland in 1975 at the very early stages of the Nyanza cleanup history, and this has been a part of our community life over the last 45 years. As I have digested the proposed plan, vapor intrusion and mitigation are a major part of the plan narrative, including A, the continued migration of contamination from the Nyakol Worcester Air Conditioning AOC into the existing contaminated groundwater plume, and B, concerns regarding the current mitigation system process. On page 9, the plan states, the ongoing migration is an unacceptable risk to human health, in particular for indoor air quality. And then slightly further on page 9, the plan relates that the vapor mitigation systems were voluntary, do not address the contamination source, and are not a statutory preference for attaining a permanent solution. Further on, the plan speaks to the exposure pathways, the exposure assessment, and then makes the following statement. Residual DNAPL within the Nyakol WAC AOC is acting as a continuing source of contamination to the contaminated groundwater plume and is considered principal threat waste. I would like to be on the record advocating for serious consideration for alternative GW5. Although both GW4 and GW5 contain no active treatment for the down gradient plume and provide for monitoring only, GW5 offers a more aggressive treatment of the source. Consequently, GW4 is estimated to take 275 years to achieve the target remediation goal throughout the site, while GW5 is estimated to take 140 years. According to the plan, this will occur without active treatment in the down gradient plume. I realize that these decisions are difficult and that your position is difficult. Serving on the select board, I do appreciate and understand that. My next statement might seem unfair, but I would like to ask that as the EPA considers all of our public comments, that your consideration include this reflection. If you and your family lived or worked in the down gradient plume area, what option would you choose and advocate for? So thank you, and I appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you. I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat your name and address? I don't think it came through for the stenographer.
For the record, Steve Mitchell, 5 Newcastle Road, and again, I serve on the select board.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to call Mark Tassoni.
Thank you. And Mark Tassoni, I'd like to comment saying, is it going to be timely, worthy, or expeditiously? Are we going to be waiting long to have results? And to have your targets behind the Worcester air conditioner and all that work, I think it is worth having that. Nyanza's been the history, the plume's been the history, and it's still going on. I'd like to understand through a comment, through my comments, that there are health issues, but there are remedies. And when you combine the two, it's got to be a compromise to understand that one may not work before the other. So I'm going in with this with wide-eyed, open mind, and cautiousness, saying what would happen when the people work, they might hit something that they weren't expecting. So be careful. The health of the residents and the people living there will be in their hands. And when EPA comes in, it would be a residential reason or a cautious optimism. Let's hope things work out, but then again, opinions work, but the results will show. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to call Rob St. Germain. I don't know if I got that right.
Rob St. Germain, 64 Winter Street here in Ashland. I'm also the chair of the Stormwater Committee. And this town is spending a lot of money right now trying to monitor the pollution from stormwater in town and to keep the Sudbury and the Charles River as clean as possible. So I would urge you, if and when this process begins, that you do increased and enhanced monitoring to ensure that the plume is not being further extended. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to call A. Ginger Esty. Ginger Esty? Thank you. Okay, the rest of the folks that have signed in, there's been a few people wrote unsure or maybe. So I'm going to call up anybody else that would like to make a formal comment.
Hi, I'm Rob Scher. I'm a member of the Ashland Select Board as well, and I live at 41 Bay Colony Drive. So I'm speaking as an individual member of that board. We have not yet met to review this. I fully expect, in line with the town manager's comments and with Mr. Mitchell's comments and others, that the town will be submitting a comprehensive comment on the proposed, and certainly appreciate your willingness to be flexible about the due date for the comments, should that be necessary. My particular comment on is that whatever the proposed plan we end up with implementing, that there be, given the history of the site and some of the maintenance issues, that there be strong provisions for ongoing monitoring, maintenance, and evaluation of how whatever proposed action is working, and that there be, given the changing nature of technology and best practices, that there be mechanisms in place to revisit and evaluate and potentially change what is going on depending on the effectiveness of the remedy. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Joel Arbeitman, 28 Woodridge Lane. I think that what it appears to me is before the residents of the town is to try to weigh in as best we're able to on the various remediation options. And I wonder, you know, when I've worked on projects where we had to go through a series of choices, we oftentimes tried to quantify certain categories and come up with almost kind of a scoring matrix. So I saw your presentation, but it was very much in a narrative form and very difficult. I mean, I'm not a scientist, and most of us aren't, to really assess, you know, which would get us quicker cleanup or what percentage of the cleanup, or, you know, and I understand some of it is guesswork or maybe even not able to be known at this time. But I wonder whether a scoring matrix of any kind has been created, or if it could be created prior to the expiration of the comment period, so that we might benefit from your expertise in trying to at least have an opportunity to weigh in on what we feel is the best option. And I would especially like that scoring matrix to be done twice. Once, including all of the factors you've already weighed in with some type of, it gets you this, but it doesn't get you that, or you know, and score it however you would. And again, without the price tag involved. Take that out of the mix and say, okay, if you had infinite funding, this would get you more cleanup, even if it's not cost-effective cleanup. But I'd like to be able to know that and understand how, you know, what role the possible funding might play in the thing. So if that's something that we could get prior to, so that we might take it into consideration in discussing this among ourselves, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Perry, 222 Arrowhead Circle. I've been an Ashland resident for about 25 years. I am, or have been most recently, the chairperson of the Nyanza Advisory Subcommittee, which is a subcommittee for the, under the Board of Selectmen, and not really as part of the formal comment, but just for the audience's benefit. It's a subcommittee with representation from the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Health, the Conservation Commission, and then some members at large. Myself, I am a former environmental engineering project manager. So we have a wide variety of expertise on the board, or on the subcommittee. And so that's, I'm not representing the subcommittee, and as the selectman said, I'm here on my own accord, so any of my comments are my own personal comments, but so for some context of what's been going on. The first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge and recognize the pain and the history of a lot of the residents here. As we've heard, the Nyanza site is one of the most tragic Superfund sites in the nation, really, and I think we can never lose sight of that. The good news is that we're moving towards reducing the exposure pathways and getting towards a cleanup goal, and I'm pleased to see this report. I was pleased to read it. I agree that it's a pretty digestible document, even for some of those who might not have a real good science background. One of the things that we were looking at on the advisory subcommittee was coming up with ways to put some similar institutional controls in terms of the use of the groundwater and vapor mitigation systems. As a town subcommittee and the methods and the possible ways that we could do that were somewhat limited. So I would say that I'm glad to see the EPA taking a more holistic approach, and you've got some better tools in your toolbox to implement those kind of institutional controls and remedies for the site. So I'm glad to see it moving forward, and I would encourage townspeople to still stay connected and stay involved, and we will stay involved as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Joseph Magnani, 2 Harper Lane. I am on the Select Board, and I was also a member of the Nyanza Study Committee as well. I'm a lifelong resident. Good Lord has put me here 64 and a half years, and I hope to be here a little longer. It's unfortunate that some of my friends and some of my classmates aren't here as a result of them coming down with different forms of cancer as a result of them living near and around that Superfund site. I've had relatives that lived on Metcalf Ave that saw their backyards change colors whenever the dye changed, or their snowflakes, different colors whenever whatever dye they were making that particular day. For them, thankfully, they lived to be 90 and 94 respectively. So what you folks are doing, what the EPA is doing in monitoring what needs to be done and needs to be cleaned up, I thoroughly and wholeheartedly support what efforts need to be done. You can't put a dollar value on someone's life. And Ashland has lost too many lives to put the dollar value. There are too many people over there that are sitting at that, in that far left side over there that I can't even imagine what they've gone through for the loss of family members. So my concern would be, is that put aside the dollar value, but get whatever needs to be done to clean up this site. I know, Lisa, we've met several times. You've made some great presentations in front of our Nyanza Study Board and the plan that was done in 2016. I think that was the last time we sat and spoke formally. Informally, we have spoke over the phone and via emails. I did notice there has been some major changes in the plume, but my big concern was the DNAPL that is still coming out of that one site that I was just totally floored when, the amounts were 55-gallon drumfuls. And, there's an issue there, and that needs to be resolved in some way, shape, or form. And, the more sites that we can do to make sure and monitor that, the better it is for all of us down the road. I know Kara used the word a clean ashland. I think that's what we all want, Kara, more than anything else. Because that would be a legacy left for our children and our grandchildren's children. I probably will never see that day, but this is a damn good start. So I appreciate anything and everything that the EPA has done and will continue to do, and we hope that the DEP steps on board with the state and continues working together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Judith Margulies. I'm an Ashland resident, 53 America Boulevard. I may not be on your sign-in sheet. I want to comment about the most upgrade area that's been identified as a source of DNAPL, and that's the area that is commonly referred to as the landfill. I wish to comment about that specifically. Many people are not aware that that is an unlined space, and having read the original documents when that was decided to be the decision as to how to place I believe it's 45,000 tons. That number just pops in my head. I didn't look it up, relook it up, of contaminants, to place it under a cap, similar to what we do with landfills today, but it's unlined. My concerns are that it is not adequately being monitored using the most recent technology. Some people believe, and I've heard this from members of the committees, that much of that contaminants is going to stay in that one location. But yet, I believe that that is a total unknown. That might be an educated guess, but it is no more than a guess. And that's a very big concern without the most deep monitoring of what is going on there. That also is important because of the recent construction around the area. Having read those decisions, those early decisions, the engineers based it upon what the area was existing at that time surrounding that area. And obviously, as time has gone by, things have changed, and without continuing monitoring in a more significant way than what I believe is being done now. The last thing that I wanted to mention was I, on occasion, have heard that individuals have purchased homes on some of the streets that may be of concern. And I would like the government, the federal government, the state government, to consider for anyone who has purchased a home and not being given adequate disclosure, for whatever reason that may be, but that could be determined by some independent group, that those people be offered the ability to sell their homes to the government. Because I believe that there may be individuals who were not given those disclosures, and for them to go back and implement suits to people because that was not disclosed to them in the last 10, 15, potentially even 20 years. I believe that they should have opportunities for recourse. Thank you.
Thank you. So seeing no more folks at the mic with further comments, I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. Yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah. So just remember that our public comment period for making written comments closes on February 14th. If anybody has any written comments tonight and just wants to hand them off to us, we're happy to take them. This hearing is now officially closed, so everything else is off the record. I did want to address one question, actually, one comment. The gentleman that stood up and asked about our comparison analysis, we actually did do a comparative analysis of the criteria, yeah. It's summarized in the proposed plan, but it's done in more detail in the feasibility study. So I suggest basically the information is in the record if you'd like to see how we compared one against the other. And to the point of cost, I just want to explain how we do consider cost. Cost is kind of the tiebreaker. We look at alternatives that are first implementable and effective, and based on that, if we have alternatives that are relatively, equal in all those criteria, cost is the tiebreaker. So cost isn't the thing we look at first, it's the thing we look at last. So with respect to those more expensive technologies or alternatives, the reason why they were selected was not just because of their cost. There were other technical issues that gave us pause in terms of how effective they would be, what the ability we would have to implement them. And that is why we chose the one we did. It wasn't strictly based on cost. So I wanted to explain that, how that criteria comes into play. So I just, didn't want to leave you out on a comment period without having what you think is the appropriate information to evaluate what we're proposing tonight. And again, we all welcome any comments on any of the alternatives that we've put forth. Thank you.